Welcome to Thursday's edition of Big Blue Kickoff live here on Giants.com as well as the mobile app. He's Paul Dottino. I'm Lance Medow with you for the next 60 minutes. It's presented by Cadillac, the official luxury vehicle of the New York Football Giants. Appreciate everybody tuning in. Multiple ways to interact with us here on the program. Of course, 201-939-4513. You can hit us up on Twitter, hashtag Giants Chat. You can also directly interact with the two of us. He is at Giants WFAN. I'm at Lance Medow, one word, last name, Medow. And as a reminder, you can find the archive of this show and our entire podcast network on the Giants mobile app, podcast platforms everywhere, and at Giants.com/podcast. As we welcome you into the Giants podcast studio presented by Hackensack Meridian Health. Keep getting better. So Paul and I are going to delve into a variety of topics. There's a very interesting article right now up on ESPN.com that gave an overview of what the 4 NFC East teams did this offseason with respect to philosophy. So Paul and I want to take a deep dive into that. But off the top, I know Matt and John on yesterday's show talked a little bit about their takeaways from OTAs. Paul and I obviously were not on the program, so we want to take a little bit of time to delve into that. And there were a few media sessions, Paul, in terms of some of the players speaking, in addition to Brian Dable. Javon Holland spoke. We had Bobby Okereke, as well as Greg Van Roden. One of the interesting things that Okereke brought up that caught my attention was he was asked about, even for a veteran, how meaningful it is to be in the same defense for the second straight season. Because the reason I entertain that, we talk so much about how difficult it is for rookies to transition. And, they have to adapt to the NFL, learn a new scheme. But I don't think more often than not we actually take into consideration when you have a veteran that is jumping from one scheme to another, it's not necessarily an easy task for them. And he even reflected on when he was with the Colts, his first 3 years, and I looked this up to confirm, Matt Eberflus was his defensive coordinator.
Right.
Then Gus Bradley took over. Then he came to the Giants. And then, obviously, you had a new defensive coordinator in his second year. So this is the first time since 3 straight years with Eberflus that he's coming back into the same defensive mechanism.
Well, on top of that, when he was with the Colts, he played some inside backer and he also played some outside backer. So he had been versatile, yes, but also playing different positions that require different approaches, different aspects of the playbook. So Bobby Okereke has digested an awful lot during his NFL career. And I think, quite frankly, I think I've gotten to know him pretty well since he's been here. I think his pride took a shot last year. I don't think he was particularly happy that, the production was not what he expected it to be. Because the year before, you could make a very strong case that he played at a Pro Bowl type level. And then last season, it just wasn't there. Now, yes, there could be a lot of reasons for that. The point is, I don't think he was happy with the results, and he intends on doing something about it.
And, of course, he was limited to 12 games. He clarified that it was a disc injury that he was dealing with in his neck, so
which
he got a little bit into
surgery.
Detail. Correct. But that's part of the reason why the numbers themselves weren't as attractive and didn't jump off the page in comparison to the previous year where he played all 17 games. So that's understandable. But he's hoping that the full health combined with the familiarity with the defense should perhaps get him back to the level, in addition to, of course, the depth that he's working with in front of him. Because even Javon Holland touched on this a little bit, because he was asked whether or not he wore the green dot helmet when he was with the Dolphins. He said, I didn't want any part of that. Let the guys that are closer to the line of scrimmage have to deal with that. And obviously it was a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek, but it got me thinking about Holland saying that, he's more than comfortable moving around in the defense, and that's another reason why he didn't want to wear the helmet, because he's got enough that he has to take care of on the back end. But a good sign of a defense is when you're not leaving it to your safeties to clean up everything from a tackling standpoint.
Well, what's kind of interesting about that, and I tended to feel the way you do, Lance, but then I kind of learned over the years that some defenses are actually schemed to have a safety lead the team in tackling. You guys will remember Jabril Wilson when he played for the Giants, and, they beat the Pats in the 2007 Super Bowl season. Jabril Wilson was the leading tackler. So I get the the traditional philosophy that if your safety is leading the defense in tackles, the traditional philosophy is that's probably not a good thing. You probably don't want that to be the case. But over the course of the last 10, 15 years, that's actually happened rather frequently with contending teams and championship teams. And it's because in many ways, they'll use one of their safeties as a guy who's going to come downhill. He's going to come down into the box. He's going to come down on the blitz. He's going to come down and fill gaps. You know, a lot of these standard free safety, strong safety positions that we used to know years ago are not the case anymore. Now teams play left safety, right safety, box safety, nickel safety.
throw them all around.
It's just they've taken the Rubik's Cube and they've jumbled it. And so the colors don't all match on every side the way they used to. So in some ways, and I've had to learn this doing this for 43 seasons now. There were some adjustments in the way the game was played and how the positions had to be redefined.
And I think you bring up a good point in terms of usage in a defense where if the safety is going to play relatively close to the line of scrimmage, then it's understandable his tackle numbers are going to be much higher than a safety that is playing far back to be that safety valve. Now, if you look at Holland's numbers, I just brought them up, he fluctuated total tackles. His high was 96. That was 2022. Now, keep in mind, he only played 12 games in 2023. But that was actually still one of his better seasons despite that. So probably if he would have played another 5 games, he could have flirted with 100 that year because he had 74 through 12. And then the other 2 seasons, he was in the low to high 60s. So Holland's numbers, it just speaks volumes, right, about his versatility. They've been all over the place from season to season between 2021 and 2024. And it comes down to, it depends on how Shane Bowen envisions utilizing his services this season.
Well, to give you an example, right, look at Troy Polamalu for the Steelers, who we all know was very versatile and was able to use a number of different roles to his advantage with the Steelers, right? I mean, quarterbacks used to talk all the time. We got to worry about where he is because you couldn't necessarily gain clues to what they were going to do on the play by where Polamalu was because they also used him as a bluff. Okay, I just looked up his numbers. 3 different times in his career, he had over 90 tackles. Okay? When your safety has 90 tackles, 100 tackles, 110 tackles, that's a ton of tackles. And there are many times on specific teams where that may be 1, 2, or 3 on the tackle chart. But, okay, let's face it. There are times that those defenses, for whatever the reason, they thought they wanted to scheme it that way, and it turned out to be effective, and it worked. So, the Giants, quite frankly, they prefer playing the left and right safety. They're not much for free safety, strong safety. They like to go left and right, which means at any given time, those guys are floatable. And that's just the way a lot of teams seem to go nowadays.
You got me thinking, and it also reminds me of conversations we had with Steve Spagnuolo when he was here. Remember, it was strong safety, free safety, but he would always refer to it as a left and a right, as opposed to a strong and a free.
He used to. The interesting part about that was, Jabril Wilson was typically a free safety, and James Butler, who was free agent from Georgia Tech, who wound up being the strong safety on that first Super Bowl team against the Pats. It was amazing because Spags did consider them free and strong, but because of Jabril Wilson's quickness and his speed and his ability to play straight ahead and downhill, he often used him as a gap filler or as a blitzer. He would come on the safety blitz. They would never send Butler, usually, on a safety blitz. It would be Wilson. Well, what does that mean? It means your strong safety's the guy deep. So that's why he used to refer to those guys sometimes as left and right, although typically they were really free and strong.
But because of their usage and how sometimes they were interchangeable, why classify them into strong and free when you see them lined up on the field and you're like, oh, wait a minute, that's not usually what a strong safety does, or that's not usually what a free safety does. Out of curiosity, I was just taking a glance at Tennessee's defenses with Shane Bowen in terms of who was up there in tackles.
Yes.
Kevin Byard was heavily involved. And the reason I'm bringing that up is, as we're talking about this subject,
he was a safety.
He was in that position.
Correct.
So it goes back to what you were insinuating earlier. Sometimes the scheme calls for the safety to be so heavily involved that maybe that's not necessarily an indication that you're leaving him out to dry and cleaning up everything, but you called for him to be in a position to make a higher volume of tackles. And something tells me they're going to put Holland in a position to get plays as opposed to just stay back and watch everything.
So, I think so too. Although I will say, Tyler Newman looks like he's the kind of guy who can do that too.
No, certainly. And you shouldn't dismiss that as well. That's why you could argue he's got two guys that could be very aggressive.
That was the point in them going after Holland in free agency. They wanted to have the ability to disguise in a pre-snap situation which safety was going to be the identifier for what scheme they were going to run on that play.
Now, just to be fair and balanced here, 2023, Bowen's last season, he had a pair of linebackers, 1 and 2 on the team in tackles. But Kevin Byard, when he was heavily involved in that defense, they utilized him a lot. And to further add context, 2023, Byard only played 4 games. So if Byard played a fully healthy season, something tells me maybe the 2 linebackers are not in the front of the pack. Just an interesting trend to take away from how Bowen utilized personnel and what he called upon.
Can we go back to Okereke for a minute?
Yeah, absolutely.
The Giants have really opened up their versatility along the defensive front. The additions of Robertson Harris, Ledbetter, Golston, Alexander, 3 free agents and a draft choice, a 3rd-round draft choice. Adding to that defensive line, this allows the Giants much more versatility, whether they're playing a 3-4 or whether they're playing 4 down on a given play. They now have the ability to do that. Lance, I've said this so many times. Last year, if they wanted to go 4 defensive linemen down, they couldn't do it. They didn't have the personnel to do it. Now they've got the personnel to do it. They've got guys like Golston who can play 3 technique or defensive end if you want him to.
Yep.
Alexander's probably in the same boat. Physically, I think he's got the tools that he can do both. They're looking at him right now as 3 technique, but I think he could play defensive end in a 4 down set. I absolutely believe that. So by adding 4 defensive linemen during this offseason, that now allows a more versatile playbook for the defensive coordinator, which in turn can also help open things up while the traffic gets caught up in the trenches for Bobby Okereke, who has always been more of a free-flow linebacker than a guy like Harry Carson, who was going to get in there and take on a blocker and a tackler at once. Okereke's more of a free-flow guy, as they say, chase and hit or run and hit linebacker. He's more of one of those instead of your typical, Harry Carson type, which there aren't very many of those anymore
because the holes
game changes.
And the voids.
Yeah. The game has changed. So I think you'll see a variety of different fronts this year that you could never even thought about last year because they didn't have the personnel on the defensive line. That, to me, right then and there, it is the beginning of what can make Bobby Okereke more effective because of what they can do in front of him.
Well, and that's why when we talk about run defense, it starts with the defensive front. Okay, if those guys are getting pushed to the sides and it's parting like the Red Sea and your linebackers are out of position, then good luck. And that's what you saw happen last season.
Or for that matter, if the offensive line, the tight end, the fullback, whoever it is, gets through your defensive line
to the next level,
guess what? They're now making a block on your second level. And Bobby Okereke doesn't have room now to go and make a play because he's got a 320-pound guard in his chest.
That's why, getting back to your point, it's so important for the defensive line. The best term that I would bring up is getting messy this season, meaning disrupting the offensive line. It's not necessarily getting in the backfield, but doing enough where those offensive linemen are not pushing forward so that they can meet the linebacker first contact. And now it's up to the corners and the safety to maneuver and get some wiggle room to make tackles out in open space.
Well, coaches use a very simple phrase. They say, we want to keep the guy clean. The Giants want to keep Okereke clean. Keep bodies off of him so that he can track the ball.
Which is why I go back to, that's why the defensive line has to do the dirty, messy work.
Absolutely.
Okay, let them get entangled so that all of a sudden Okereke can then read what's coming his way, and he doesn't have a lot of traffic and a lot of big bodies that he has to deal with. Because listen, it's hard enough to bring the running back down. If you got to then deal with a blocker on top of the running back, good luck.
And I think that, as much as anything, was one of the reasons why Okereke's production dropped. Because I just don't think they had, I guess the word is, they didn't have enough on the defensive line to allow him to operate as he wanted to.
So you brought up some of the personnel they brought in, and that's a great segue to this ESPN article, which was, I think, a really interesting read. And it's only one person's perspective, of course. It doesn't make anybody right or wrong, just their overview. This is Bill Barnwell, who just posted this article recently on ESPN.com. And I want to read the intro to give you an idea of what he was discussing throughout this article, because he ranked and discussed every team, at least in the NFC, from this section of the article. He wrote, May is graduation season, so it seems like natural time to hand out superlatives for each NFL team hitting the highs and lows of their offseason hauls. Last week, I handed out superlatives to the AFC 16 teams, hitting on everything from the Browns' quarterback additions to the Chiefs approaching unprecedented levels of inexperience on Patrick Mahomes' blind side. Now it's time to move to the NFC, which he did a very similar exercise. So, Paul, let's start with the Giants. His superlative for the Giants, this was a one-sentence response, most likely to throw deep more often. And it's a play on, if you open up a yearbook, they write most likely to succeed and most likely to be the class clown or whatever it is. So that's what he was playing off of, just for those of you trying to follow along. And
I was most talkative.
that is a stunning development. Is that actually in the yearbook? I would love to see the page. You've got to bring that in one day then.
It was a landslide victory.
How fitting. Do you talk to any of your high school classmates?
I got kicked out of my high school library. I was
for being
banned.
too talkative.
Yes.
Sure. Yeah.
I was banned.
Yeah.
I was banned.
Okay.
I had to go to the town library to do my assignments.
So a public library, essentially.
Yes, because the school librarian...
And you didn't get kicked out of the public library?
No,
because why would you change your routine?
Well, here was the thing.
It's still a library at the end of the day.
If I had to do an assignment, which involved a book or encyclopedias that you had to use to get the research for the project.
You need to be there present.
Well, we didn't have the internet in those days, okay? We had stone tablets.
You're dating yourself, but go ahead.
We had stone tablets, okay? That's what we had in those days. And so once I got banned from the high school library, and I knew, I'm going to need books and encyclopedias to do this work, I'm going to have to go to the town library, and if I get kicked out of there, where am I going to go? So I had to be quiet when I went to the town library. But the high school librarian, she banned me. She actually kicked me out and banned me.
Wow.
I don't know of anyone else who had ever been banned from my high school library.
Well, I mean, you should wear that with pride, that you may be in a league of your own. And that nobody else has followed since. I'm surprised they didn't put your photo up on the front door so that in case, the librarian had a day off, that her replacement
she never missed.
To keep close tabs on.
She never missed. She was a workaholic. She never missed. And she would. And the funny part was, one time I snuck in, and she caught me. You should have heard her. She was the one screaming to get me kicked out.
Yeah, well, she runs a tight ship.
But who got the last laugh? The most talkative, right? The guy who couldn't keep his mouth shut, who just, was very vocal.
Yes.
Turned out I did okay for myself.
Well, you capitalized on that facet of your characteristic.
She had a bunch of old, dusty books to look through.
Wow, boy. I didn't think we would get some shots. That poor librarian. Goodness gracious. Still feeling the wrath of Paul Dottino years later. Okay, as we try to steer the ship back on track here after giving a little opportunity to Paul to reminisce about his librarian days. The superlative, again, was most likely to throw deep more often this season for the Giants. And He threw out some numbers, and here's the numbers, and clearly these are not positives that jump off the page. They ranked 24th in deep pass rate last season, the Giants.
Yeah.
They were 26th in quarterback rating on deep throws. And how about this? They have ranked 30th in deep pass rate over the past 3 seasons. This is not just an outlier from 2024. This has been something that's been prevalent over the last 3 years. So here comes Russell Wilson. He's thrown 13% of his passes 20 or more yards down the field over the past 3 years. That's the 4th highest rate in football. Jameis Winston, just behind. He was 6th. Who's in between them, interestingly? Josh Allen, who Brian Dable helped groom in his early days in Buffalo. So you read between the lines, you put all those things together. Nobody's saying, though, remember, there's a difference, Paul. It's similar to what I say about turnovers. I say turnovers are great, but it's about what you do with them.
Yes.
Deep throws are great, but it's about what you do with them. So the conversion rate.
Points.
Correct. The conversion rate, success rate is the other half of the battle here.
Well, I think the thing that really ticks me off about the Giants, and yes, when your offensive line is suspect, it makes it harder for the quarterback to sit back there and pick out the deep throws. I understand that, and that's certainly part of this equation. Another part of the equation is the quarterback play hasn't been very good the last couple of years. We know that. Things fell apart. The whole Daniel Jones story just crumbled, and then they were, throwing backup guys in there every other week, and you just didn't have a very high level of efficiency. But the other part to this, and I mentioned this on a show I did last night, I had the Giants with 40 drops last season, which if you go to any of the stat services that track this stuff, everybody has a little bit of a different number because it's all subjective.
Yep.
But every list that I looked at, 40 would have led the NFL. So my take on this is really simple. It's not just changing the quarterback. Russell Wilson, okay, if they give him a decent amount of time, and we think this offensive line that they have right now with the room and the depth could do that. Well, it doesn't matter how great Russell Wilson is at throwing the moon ball and trying to hit guys 40 and 50 yards downfield. If they don't finish the play, it's incomplete. Case closed. And now you have a golden opportunity that goes by the wayside. The Giants are not good enough to afford to waste opportunities. So I'm imploring the Giants' skill position players. I mean, I had Malik Neighbors for 11 drops last year. No one is downgrading his ability and his talent, his explosiveness, everything that he brings to the table. The guy's an incredible athlete and an incredible player. He caught over 100 balls. He also had 11 drops. That's got to stop. Okay? It's got to stop. You got to cut that in half. If you really want to be elite in this league. I know he was named to the Pro Bowl. He was an alternate and then got elevated. But 6% is the number. That's the max number on drops. If on 6% of your catches. So if you catch 100 balls and you drop 6, that's the limit. All right? Once the number gets over 6%, it's a big problem. Coaches don't want to see that. Well, the Giants have had way too many drops over recent years. So please, don't think that Russell Wilson's addition automatically makes big plays happen. These guys got to complete the play on the other end of the ball.
Plus, all the drops that you charted were not necessarily all on deep throws, too. Let's not forget.
Well, I have...
You have the breakdown, but I guarantee you all 40 were not deep throws.
No.
So,
what I do have, I chart whether or not the throw was a first down. Okay?
Gotcha.
Now, of course, first down throws can be short, too. But in most cases, throws that would convert a first down are usually on the longer side. Not necessarily 30, 40, 50 yarders, but they're going to probably be 10 yards or more in most cases. I didn't chart the yardage on all those drops, but here's what I'll give you. And this is very, very disappointing. And this is part of the reason why the Giants' passing game has been a mess. Okay? Of the 40 drops that I logged the Giants for last year, okay, 16 of those throws would be on the sticks and would have been first downs. Okay? 16 of the 40
so
would have been first downs.
Right there. Yeah.
and they couldn't hold on to the ball. All right?
And that'll stunt an offense as a result.
How about this? 14 of the drops, 14 of the 40, were drops on either third or fourth down that ended a drive. Folks, it's not just about the quarterback. Please, please keep your eyes open and watch for the drops. You've got to eliminate those things. Otherwise, Russell Wilson's numbers and his beautiful passes are not going to result in the points that you want.
Well, I think there's a lot of factors that come into play with respect to the deep ball. As you mentioned, it's the receivers on the opposite end. It's the offensive line. It's the quarterback's willingness, Paul, to throw the ball down the field. Let's not forget about that.
Yeah, Wilson will hold the ball longer because he, much like Eli Manning, and Eli did this in many of his seasons, he would hold the ball and take the sack and live for another day instead of taking the risk of throwing a pick.
Well, and that's also a risk by holding onto the football, because if you take a sack, then it's negative yardage, and now you're facing a tougher second or third down. So, I mean, there's a give and take relationship just based on that thought process. But the article does talk about Darius Slayton and Malik Neighbors' presence should help there. They did not bring up Jalen Hyatt, but I'll throw him into the mix because there's a third potential option that could open things up deep depending on how the depth chart plays out. And mentions Andrew Thomas returning from injury, Evan Neal experimenting with guard, which Brian Dable talked about during his press conference yesterday, and then, clearly having Jermaine Illuminor still in the mix at the other tackle spot. So the continuity factor, and even Greg Van Roden brought it up about, the guys coming back and having familiarity playing next to John Michael Schmitz and so forth and all that. And listen, in fairness, Paul, I don't want to say, just like you said, Russell Wilson throwing deep is going to solve everything, because we've talked about continuity in years past, remember? And then all of a sudden, 2-3 games into the season, somebody goes down and continuity gets thrown out the window. So it's nice to talk about, right? It's nice to look at. It doesn't mean that it's going to solve all your problems. So it's cautious optimism, I guess, when we talk about a lot of these topics.
Well, it's kind of like, spilling the drink on your laptop computer. All your plans immediately short circuit and go haywire. That's it. Boom. No, doesn't work now. Nothing you can do. We spilled it. It's done. And that's what's happened, in a lot of ways to the Giants' offensive line, for the last how many years. But I will say this. Jalen Hyatt, I want to just throw him out there for 1 second before you go. I guess you want to go to Dallas next. But I want to throw this out there. Jalen Hyatt continues to work his butt off during this offseason like he has in the past. This is his third year. It's got to be his breakout year. I mean, when they drafted him in the third round, they had a certain expectation as to what he was going to do for this team, specifically with the deep ball. It's never really come to fruition. He's a good kid. He works hard. Great attitude. The teammates all like him. And for whatever reason, it's a mystery to me, it hasn't happened. Since Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston have gotten onto this property, they have gone out of their way. It's been very noticeable with every single opportunity they have to talk about. They mention him. Both quarterbacks, the veterans.
Specifically, Russ was very high on him, even in his introductory presser.
Yes.
Yeah.
And from what we saw here at the OTAs, they're giving him a lot of opportunities to catch the ball. And hoping that it will translate into the spark that makes him a weapon. I'm going to have my eyes on him big time during training camp and during the preseason, because if they can unlock Hyatt, and again, Winston and Wilson have been very excited in talking about him, that could be a big deal.
Well, when Matt Sitek and I did the show last week, we talked about what to look for during OTAs and specifically the player to watch, and Hyatt was first on my list without any hesitation. That's the guy.
He caught a bunch of passes yesterday, including touchdowns.
Yeah. Now, it's got to translate to when the pads go on, okay? Running around in T-shirts and shorts, as Brian Dable talks about. By the way, quick side note, I love the fact, and I know he brought this up previously, but I thought he encompassed the OTA period beautifully by saying it's a passing camp. That's what this time period is. It's a passing camp. I mean, let's call it what it is. Right. That's exactly what they do. Okay? You can't touch anybody. You can't look at anybody the wrong way. You're going through the motions and you're throwing passes. That's it. No, but that's the reality of it. And I almost wish that we got rid of organized team activities is so convoluted, and people see that, and it's so fancy and and sexy.
That's part of the modern NFL.
Well,
it wasn't like this when I started.
No, of course, but it hasn't been like that for quite some time, Paul. So it's not as if this happened yesterday.
I know.
Okay, it should be clarified, I think, over and over again, because people who think that they're going to have massive takeaways from this time period, I think, are living dreams of grandeur. But getting back to the point you
mean counting all the snaps for the quarterbacks doesn't mean much to you,
or the completion percentage? Yeah, don't get me started. Okay,
stats for OTAs.
Yeah,
can you think of anything more clown-like?
Well, how about attendance, too, for voluntary periods? I love it. Brian Dable always, when he's asked about attendance, he goes, well, yeah, it's great when guys show up even though it's voluntary. I mean, It's like he reminds everybody,
I know.
By the way, according to the CBA, it's voluntary.
But I did love the fact that he flat out yesterday, very early, volunteered that everybody is here.
He did.
They're not all going to be on the field. Some guys are nicked up. Yeah. Some guys are sick. But there's 100% attendance. So he nipped that one in the bud right away. It's like, okay, just don't even ask me that question because it's dumb.
And he did, by the way, bring up that Neighbors had been dealing with a toe issue but did not have an off-season procedure or anything like that. They're just being very careful with how much work they want to give him at this point. So the deep ball, that's the superlative for the Giants based on this ESPN article. Now, the other three NFC East teams were brought into the conversation as well. For Dallas, it was most likely to look at their old scouting reports. And this was an interesting point that was brought up because we talk a lot about philosophies of the NFL, building through the draft, filling voids through free agency. What was noticeable about the Cowboys this offseason is they're taking chances on former first-round picks and second-round picks across the board that did not pan out with their original teams, but they're buying into their track record of drafting guys and developing them will now work with guys that are still young, have upside and potential. So, Kaiir Elam, former Bills corner they brought in, former Chargers and Titans linebacker Kenneth Murray, and both of those guys were acquired, by the way, via trades. Then they brought in Solomon Thomas and Dante Fowler. Now, Fowler had previously been with the Cowboys. These were a pair of former top 5 picks. Peyton Turner, who I was very high on coming out of the draft, another first-rounder with the Saints. These are guys, by the way, that have really big length and frames in terms of getting after the quarterbacks, but the common element is, now I would argue Thomas and Fowler, I think, have really done a nice job since they've left their original teams. But Turner, it's yet to be seen. And you go back to their original drafted teams, Thomas and Fowler, it was a lot of growing pains. They brought in Javonte Williams, who was originally with Denver. He was a relatively high pick. They acquired George Pickens from the Steelers. Paris Campbell, who's been with a few teams, who was even with the Giants here. And I thought that was interesting. And Dallas banking on, okay, our scouts pinpointing these guys, our coaching staff, that will help perhaps bring in some production, unlike maybe what we did in previous years where we made a big splash or two on a more recognizable free agent.
Well, without going too deep and spending a ton of time on the Cowboys, I will simply say this. Because of the salary cap situation and the money they've got to devote to guys like Lamb and Prescott, and of course Parsons still doesn't have his new deal yet, and Diggs in the secondary, they don't have much of a choice. They've got to go the recycled route. And so I get it. If you're going to have to fill a lot of your roster and a whole bunch of your depth chart slots with recycled players, you might as well go back to your draft notes and say, hey, if we got to go to recycled players, let's at least get guys who are high picks, who we thought high of when they came out, regardless of whether or not they've been inconsistent in the pros or been injured in the pros. If we can get them cheaply, those recycled things might just hold enough water to keep us afloat. I understand.
And Joe Shane, by the way, talks a lot about this. This is why it's not about just the guys you draft. It's about everybody, because you're going to go back to your notes and your own scout team when free agency comes up. For example, Javon Holland. I guarantee you they went back also into their draft file of Holland.
Question.
Okay? And they looked at the pros and cons and got feedback and said, oh, okay, we were very high on him. And of course, Joe Shane was in Buffalo when Holland was drafted.
Debo too.
Correct. Same thing with Paul Adebo going to the Saints. You go back to your draft file, and Dallas clearly has adopted that philosophy. Now, Washington, the superlative for them, the opposite end of the spectrum.
Yes.
It was most likely to eat an early dinner and go to sleep at a sensible time. And the rationale behind that was they were a veteran-laden team last season, and they decided, well, it worked out. Adam Peters, the general manager, for the guys that he brought in because the drafts had not been very good when Ron Rivera was there. So he said, all right, we'll re-sign a number of these guys and we'll stay up there in age, but we'll also not lock ourselves up. There's a positive to tie up maybe younger free agents. So you look at the Zach Ertzes, the Bobby Wagners, the Andrew Wileys, Dante Fowler they had. He now went over to Dallas. They acquired Deebo Samuel Sr. Okay, he's 29 years old. Laramie Tunzel, 31. Jonathan Jones is 32 in September. He's going to replace Benjamin St-Juste. Will Harris is 29. He's going to take the place of Jeremy Chin, the safety who went to the Raiders. They lose Jonathan Allen, but they bring in Javon Kinlaw, who's had a few years in the NFL. So the point is, we're going to stick with the proven vets because we need a little bit more time to stock up in the draft. Now, that could do wonders like it did last season, Paul, or these guys get banged up and they can't stay on the field and all of a sudden it bites you, you know where. So they're also walking that fine line in terms of their philosophy.
Well, the two things they have to be most concerned about is, number one, they're now the targeted. And there's a little difference on the football field every Sunday when you're the targeted instead of the team that's trying to climb up. I think Washington caught a lot of people by surprise last year.
Absolutely.
Their quarterback, heck, we saw what happened with C.J. Stroud, right? He took a step back. Most guys will take a step back in year two. They're not going to get Jaden Daniels, drinking the magical mystery potion to win a whole bunch of games with miraculous plays like they did last year. That's not going to happen. Coordinators now have a year of film on him, and they will not get caught off guard by a lot of stuff that was done. A lot of it was just pure athleticism. Well, guess what? They know now. So there will be adjustments made by the rest of the league to him. In addition to that, you mentioned the older guys. Well, when you're the targeted, the season does tend to beat you up a little bit more than when you're trying to climb the mountain. And how will these older, wearier bones kind of withstand that kind of pressure and that kind of heat as these young guns around the league are trying to come after them? It'll be interesting.
Well, and that's why I think the ideal formula, and remember, Adam Peters now has another draft class that he's bringing in fairness, okay? So I think that will help, but you also look at a few players last season, like a Luke McCaffrey. He didn't play much. Are they going to give him more to try to? Because I think if you're Washington, and we've talked a lot about this with the Giants. How many times, Paul, have I brought up to you, it's not about this year's draft class, it's about the previous draft class. It's got to be a growing process, and you're adding layers and layers to the roster. So if you're Washington, there's nothing wrong about bringing the veterans back, but simultaneously, you now have to bring those younger guys along that were in Jaden Daniels' draft class and now this group. And if that happens successfully, that then could limit and bring down the level of risk that they're relying on with their vets. Now, the Eagles, a team that also has relied on a lot of vets, the superlative for Philly, most likely to inspire jealousy in other teams. And the bulk of the write-up was just what Howie Roseman is doing in terms of getting ahead of contracts.
Yes.
He does not wait till the last second. He locks guys up. He has done that with his offensive linemen. He has done that with his wide receivers. He did that with Saquon Barkley. Now, the article also brought up, but on the defensive side, it's a youth movement. They did not lock up the guys on defense. I mean, outside of Zach Bond, who had, by the way, a stellar season last year. That was an excellent signing for Philadelphia. You got to give credit where credit is due. It's a bunch of younger players around him. Not to say that there's not other vets, but if you look at just the makeup, because they parted ways with Darius Slay. They parted ways with Josh Sweat. No Brandon Graham. No C.J. Gardner-Johnson. So that's a lot of experience that they lost. So as a result, you don't have a lot of spending money. You're going to have to, once again, rely on what you brought in to the mix in the draft over the last few years. And Joe Burrow was even quoted this offseason saying he wants Cincinnati to model what Philadelphia, well, they locked up their pair of wide receivers, so perhaps they're looking at things. I want to read out a number here, which is very interesting. According to ESPN.com, Roseman is set to spend a whopping $217.3 million on the offensive side of the ball in 2025. That is $30 million, Paul, more than any other team, with the Chiefs in second at $187.2 million. So that's a pretty noticeable disparity. Now, they won the Super Bowl this year with 17th being their ranking in cash spending on that side of the ball, which also I thought was a very interesting number. You got to give, once again, the Eagles credit for even the imbalance that they present, and they still find a way.
Their front office has done a sensational job. There's no other way to cut this. The last few years, they have really found the right mixture of veterans, of young guys, of good draft picks, of economically efficient players. I was looking at their depth chart, okay? Opening day 2025. It's going to be hard to find somebody who was imported during this offseason to crack their starting lineup, either on offense or defense.
Now, are you talking about a free agent and draft picks? Are you talking about the combination of both?
Yeah.
Well, I'm bringing up their depth chart right now.
There may be one or two guys who cracked the starting lineup week one. Otherwise, it's all guys who came from inside the Eagles system or guys that they had acquired previously.
Sure.
Like the Kobe Dean. Right.
Yeah. But who's been in the system for
He's been in the
few
system.
years. Yeah.
But can you right now, if I said to you, put a gold bar down on the table and say, okay, let's say 3. Can you see 3 possible starters week one that were off-season imports this year? Well, I don't see 3.
Well, I'll tell you right now, the offense.
Tunzel, obviously.
The offense is back from last season, essentially. So
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Tunzel was
in Washington.
I'm
correct.
sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let me correct that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So you're not going to find it on offense. I do like the addition, in fairness, I do like the addition of A.J. Dillon, but Barkley's their starter.
Correct.
So he'll probably get some playing time, but it's not going to be enough to justify what you're talking about. Now let me take a glance at the defense here, just to see some of the new names, if anybody jumps off the page. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of guys that were previously drafted that are going to get more playing time, to your point. But as far as newbies...
Imports.
Yeah.
That's the key word.
Correct. Imports.
Imports.
I will say that. Here's the one guy. The one guy I'm very anxious to see, and I could see him, is Azeez Ojulari. I could see Ojulari tapping in. Assuming he stays healthy, Paul, that would be my answer now that I'm looking at the defensive side of the ball. No? You don't think that...
I like him a lot as a player. Always liked him here.
Sure.
The durability factor.
No,
you just can't rely on him to be available
okay,
enough.
but look at it from a talent
he's got
lens
the talent.
in how they rotate personnel.
He's got the
and
talent.
keep him fresh. That's a very intriguing fit.
Oh, it could be.
So that would be my response to you.
Okay. All right, but again, he'd be a rotation. He wouldn't be a starter.
He would,
He's a rotational
but
guy.
all of those guys, the numbers could balance out, though. So,
all right, but you see how hard you had to look?
No, without a doubt, yeah. But that goes back to this is the way you want to build your franchise. You lose free agents, but you have drafted guys in the previous 2 years that you've molded, and they're ready to step in. And, oh, by the way, they're not stressing out your salary cap, so you can afford to utilize resources on the offensive side of the ball. That's why Philadelphia is not cheating the game. They're not finding some
only with
leeway.
the tush push. That's the only cheating.
Okay,
that they're
well,
doing.
I'm not going to get into that with you. We talked about that last week.
I know.
But I'm looking at it through a salary cap system. They are playing the game like everybody else. But Roseman has decided, I want to put a lot of the heavy resources on the offensive side of the ball. I want to draft on defense. I'm going to part ways with the proven commodities. We're not going to pay the pass rushers an exorbitant amount of money. And then we're going to bring in, little by little, linebackers, secondary players through the draft. And they're going to be productive guys. And even if you look at some of their drafted players on the defensive side of the ball, Sidney Brown, we've seen him shown some flashes. Reed Blankenship helped them win the Super Bowl. I mean, he played an integral role. Quinyon Mitchell, who was a first-round pick last year. Cooper at the nickelback / corner and safety position. I mean, I just read you their entire secondary. Paul, they were drafted in the last 3 years, all of these guys.
They are an outstanding organization. The Chiefs are an outstanding organization. The Steelers are an outstanding organization. These are teams that understand the philosophies that you need to build the team the right way, to give yourself an opportunity, despite free agency and the salary cap, which does everything it can to shred your roster to ribbons and prevent you from being a dominant team or a contending team over the course of a handful of years. No, somehow Kansas City, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh have figured out ways to avoid that. And it's all about being internally strong. Really is what it comes down to. Make the right personnel selections so you can be internally strong and don't have to constantly import guys from the outside.
The draft does wonders for teams, and I think it also says a lot about the coaching staff, taking the time to develop the guys, especially when they don't play, and having the willingness to sprinkle them in the years before they become starters, Paul, because it can't be baptism by fire. You've got to expose them a little bit, because I think the front office, you have to be confident that if I'm going to move on from an established secondary player, linebacker, or pass rusher, it's not so much the game of the unknown. You've got to have a little bit of substance on the page to say, what did you see in the film room when you talk to the guy? How well does he know the X's and O's? What have you seen in the practice field that if we all of a sudden exponentially improve his snap count, that we're not going to be hanging on by a thin thread?
Well, part of that's the whole chicken and the egg thing. You can afford to do that when your team is in the mix and doing well. If your team isn't very good and you're struggling just to be a 500 team or to be competitive, you're not going to take a chance and start feeding those guys, because it's like, well, we're trying to just win games here. Yeah. All right. We're just trying to be decent.
And coaches keeping their jobs and so forth.
That's why everything about the NFL, I go back to it, folks. It's a spider web.
Bingo. We met our quota. That's one on today's show. There we go. I'm not going to disagree with you. I think that is the one term I've adopted, and I think there's some serious backing with respect to that. This is Thursday's edition of Big Blue Kickoff Live. It's presented by Cadillac, the official luxury vehicle of the New York Football Giants, as we are in the Giants podcast studio, presented by Hackensack Meridian Health. Keep getting better. Let's open up the phone lines as we move forward here to the finish line. We check in with Coach Marvin in Delaware. Coach Marvin, welcome aboard. What do you got for us?
How you doing, Paul?
Hey, Coach.
And welcome back, Lance. I've been talking to you.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Yeah, it's been a long time no speak.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. I do still follow you on Instagram, so I saw you a couple of times. You posted something a couple of times, so still see it. You guys were talking about organizations. You forgot one. The Baltimore Ravens.
Yes.
Is one of those teams.
And there's a few others, too, in fairness.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, those teams have really good organizations, and I think I have to put Baltimore and Eagles close to each other. Way they operate their systems and who they draft and who they bring in as free agents. What I was going to talk about is I want to ask you guys a question. It was about the defense and Shane Bowen and his system. I mean, I support all coaches, no matter who it is. I'm not going to say anything's wrong with what they're doing. I like to see them be a little more aggressive. And this year it seems like they're going to have to be a little more creative because of the talent they have in the secondary and on that in that front line. I'd like to see them get a little more creative. But Bobby Okereke didn't have a good season, and Deonte Banks didn't have a good season. And I'm wondering, was some of that with the system, because they didn't do that under the last coordinator, under Wendell. So I'm wondering, do y'all think it had anything to do with the schemes that they had to learn last year?
Well, I think it's a combination of multiple factors. I don't think it's one area specifically that you could pinpoint to say this is why this guy struggled. I think if you ask most of the players, and Okereke, I think, did a nice job really being up front when he spoke to the media yesterday, where clearly he was not 100% healthy. That was number one. Number two, you had to get down and dirty up front to try to help with the run defense, which struggled mightily, so there wasn't a lot of free space. And then he had not been in the same defense himself. I mean, even polished veterans have adjustments. I mean, remember, he had to make the transition from Wink Martindale to Shane Bowen, no different than Deonte Banks. The only difference is Okerike's been exposed to multiple defenses on the NFL level, so you figure, okay, maybe that gives him a little bit more leeway. Banks, and I'm not making excuses for Banks, but Banks was a first-round pick in 23. So, I mean, he's still getting his feet wet in the NFL. 24 was year 2, and already he's learning a new defense. And I say this about quarterbacks all the time. You draft a quarterback 1 year, he learns an offense. You get rid of the coach. Year 2, now he has to learn a new offense. And, oh, by the way, he's still adapting to life in the NFL. If it's very hard on a quarterback, I mean, what makes you think it's going to be that much easier on another position? So I just named you a few factors, and it's not to meander around the question. I think deep down inside, they would tell you themselves it's not just one item.
You know what's interesting, Coach? Last year, the Giants were 9th in blitz percentage at 28%. And we came into the season saying that Shane Bowen really doesn't want to do that very much. Well, obviously, he was well under the 40+% that Wink Martindale used the year before. But 9th in the NFL at 28% blitz percentage is a lot more than I think any of us thought that Shane Bowen was going to do. Now, having said that, what I don't think he did very much of was play press coverage. He did not have his corners doing a lot of jamming at the line of scrimmage. And when you say you'd like to see him be more aggressive, that's an area where I would love to see them pick up the stats. I would love to see, allowing Tate Banks to do what he does best, and that is press coverage and beating guys up at the line of scrimmage. Adebo's the same way. He can play both. He can play off man. He can play zone. He can play, he can do it all. But Adebo is best at press. So is Banks. So when you say more aggressive, Coach, I'm going to turn that a little bit and say more specifically, I'd love to see more man and press on the outside.
And I can agree with that. I agree with both of you guys on that. I'd like to see them in press because that's what Banks does best is press man rather than zone. So I'd like to see them, and that doesn't. I'm not going to give Banks the out on this. He's going to have to adjust to that to the play calling also.
No doubt.
But I would like to see them utilize their players in a manner that's best for those players. What do they do best? And you have to somehow incorporate that in your play calling and in your playbook itself. And, because this year we drafted some guys that are really flexible. This is a pretty good draft class. I like the attitudes that they brought in. If you listen to Abdul Carter, the way he talks in a manner that's going to be aggressive. Scatterbull, he talks in a leadership manner. I'm saying in a manner that you gravitate to these guys. And Jackson Dart, I haven't seen it, but from what I'm hearing, he has a similar personality. And then you add these personalities with somebody like Malik Neighbors. This looks like a new group of leadership that's all of a sudden coming into the Giants now, which may change the dynamic of the locker room. Not to say that Dexter is not a leader, not to say that Bobby is not a leader, but they're different types of leaders. They don't talk in a really upset manner. I don't know how to put it, where they really, really angry. But if you listen,
Coach, you should have been in the locker room after some of those losses last year. There were guys who had fire coming out of their ears. Brian Burns, Dexter Lawrence in particular. They were furious at some of those losses last season.
I can understand that, but I'm just saying from what I can see, Neighbors is a different type of person when he's talking.
No,
in that
sure,
manner.
but you're also
in the same manner.
In fairness, and we'll let you go on that note, Coach Marvin. Appreciate the phone call. You're also, keep in mind, you're judging these players from press conferences, and I think what Paul was getting at is you don't see a lot of their personality when they're out of the public setting, and guys act differently. When you're one-on-one with a teammate, you're going to have a more heart-to-heart conversation. You're not going to air out your dirty laundry and your grievances with reporters because that's probably going to come back to bite you. So just because because perhaps, let's say, Okereke and Dex don't get heated when speaking with the media does not mean that they're not upset and they're not giving it to their teammates. But I think leadership is shown in many different forms. I don't look at the vocal guy as the only facet of leadership. There are guys that are quiet and they work hard on the practice field and they serve as an example. Other guys follow and they're willing to run through a brick wall for a guy because they see his work habits. So I wouldn't read so much into that from that standpoint. And just quickly getting back to the point about, I think any defensive coordinator, especially after year one, you want to get feedback from your players, okay? And that's, I'm sure, critical for Shane Bowen this year. What worked for you guys? What did you like? What didn't you like? That's number one. And, also then try to learn what you saw out of your play calling and said, maybe I would have probably done this differently in this circumstance. Because here's the thing. You mentioned Banks is great in press coverage. I don't disagree. But there's going to be some plays where you don't want him playing press coverage, right? I mean, that's just football 101.
And he's a pro, so it's his responsibility to make sure he learns.
Exactly. So the point is, the player has to give in a little bit.
Absolutely.
Just as the defensive coordinator does, is what I'm getting at.
It's on both.
Yeah.
That's why they call it a team.
Yep, 100%. I don't know if this guy makes our cut for the team, but we'll try to fit in Wilson and Roxbury here on Big Blue Kickoff Live. What's happening, Wilson?
Hey, Lance. Hey, Paulie. Listen.
Hi.
Lance, Paulie went at me last week. I took it like a man, and he told me that my hypotheticals are crazy, and maybe I should take a little break from calling until the season starts.
And clearly you didn't follow that advice based on this phone call. Yes.
I'm going to take you up on it. But, I made the mistake of actually listening to the show after I hanged up, and my name was mentioned a lot.
And you patted yourself on the back, and you told your family. Yes.
People's buttons the wrong way. I must have that effect on people. But, Paulie, I'm gonna ask you something.
Yeah.
And all right. See, I'm gonna call Roger Goodell, right? And I'm gonna tell him that the Giants, we need like a third column, because wins and losses are not enough. We need like wins, loss, and a loss with an excuse. Because according to you, last week, you can start 4-0. And squeak by every team and be lucky you won 4 games, and you can start 0-4 and be in it in every game. And at the end of the day, it's about the same thing.
I would never say that's the same thing.
Like when you're 3-14,
Wilson, be careful. Come on, be careful. Be careful and listen to everything that's said in its context. I would never say 4-0 is the same as 0-4 under any circumstances. No, absolutely not.
Okay. Well, let me ask you something, because I don't want to, and I guess I'm going to take a little break, but I want to ask you and Lance something, and I'm going to hang up. And answer me as truthful as you can. When is playing hard, not quitting on this head coach, improvement, all that stuff you tell me all the time, when is that going to be secondary? And when is actually wins and losses going to matter for this head coach, for this organization? When? 2 years, 3 years, 5 years? Just give me a number, because I don't know. Like I said, when you're 3-14, you're 3-14. I don't care if you were in it in every game. You lost 14 games. But obviously, a lot of people don't think like that. So with all due respect, just tell me when it's wins and losses going to matter. And thank you,
okay,
guys.
Wilson. All right, Wilson. We'll let you go on that note.
Depending upon the circumstances. And I think it's really hard to imagine that if this team wins 3 games again this year, it is hard to imagine that that's going to be okay. I can't even think, because realistically, right, let's just talk about logic. If the Giants play significantly better this year, they should win more than 3 games, even with a tough schedule. We've kind of used this as the number we've kicked around, Lance. I don't know how many times you've done it on your shows. But we've kind of said they could be a much better team, and it would not be surprising if they won 6 or 7 games, which would be double the win total of last year. I think most people with a rational train of thought would say, okay, that is an arrow pointing in the right direction. That's reason to stay the course and see if they can continue that improvement. It's hard to imagine if the team wins 3 games again this year, or wins only 4 games this year, it is hard to imagine that they will show significant improvement and still wind up with a relatively equal win total as they did in 2024. That's hard to imagine. It could happen, but it's very unlikely.
Well, listen, the NFL is defined by parity. We talk about it all the time. There's competitive balance, however you want to spin it. It's not as overwhelming in this league compared to other leagues to flip the switch within the span of a year. That doesn't make it easy. I mean, they were at 6 wins in 2023. They dipped to 3 in 2024. They were 9 in 2022. So if you look at the last 3 years, they've dipped 3 games. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not going to win any games this year. That's not what I'm insinuating, but you're not guaranteed to move up the ladder. You're not guaranteed to absolutely not match what you did last season. I mean, clearly there's new talent. There's a bit of a new philosophy. You hope that some of the guys are back healthy. And to your point, even though the schedule is difficult, the product should be a lot better. I mean, just based on the quarterback situation alone, okay? If you don't even want to evaluate anything else, the quarterback should upgrade the offense. Now, I can't guarantee you that that's going to be synonymous with X amount of wins.
Right.
But the other thing that I also would put aside the wins and the losses here for a second, Paul, that I think the front office ownership is going to have to take into consideration is Jackson Dart here, whether he plays or not. What is best for him? How do you dismiss that? You can't make a decision with that on an island. That has to be a part of the equation, meaning whatever happens with the relationship between Brian Daboll and him and the offensive staff, once again, whether he plays 1 game, whether he plays no games, whether he plays half a season, you have to say to yourself, do we like what is happening behind closed doors? Do we think that that has the potential to grow? And if that's the answer and the record is not great, well, you got to weigh heavily Dart's future. So that is a big part of the equation,
it's always
just
context.
as much as the standings.
That's the point.
Yeah.
It's always context. Wilson never wants to take anything into context. He just wants to take the words right off the page and then he reacts. No, context is not just important, it's critical. It is paramount. And I will say this, one other closing item about this scenario. When you look at the Giants, and I've often talked about the first 4 games that, bare minimum, you always want to be bare minimum is 2-2. No matter how a schedule looks, you always want to say, well, give me 2-2 out of the first month, because now we're creating a 13-game season where you finally got your sea legs under you in week 5, and you'll take your chances. Well, this year, with the first 2 games on the road against division foes, the 2-2 that you get to, if you do, better be the right 2-2. You better not be 0-2 against the NFC East and upset the Chiefs and the Chargers. To be frank with you, I'd rather have a win against Washington or Dallas than upsetting Kansas City.
Yeah, well, for tiebreaker in divisional play. Yeah, it goes without saying.
All wins are not created equal.
Yep.
All losses are not created equal. So if you go 2-2 through 4, you better make sure you pick the right 2 and get at least one of those games out of the NFC East.
And those games come fast and furious and right out of the gates. I'm not a huge fan of that, but it is what it is. Some years we have some early games in the division. I think they're better off waiting till teams get a feel for one another, but the Giants, they're going to have to be ready to go for a battle royale immediately, because if you get in an early hole, then all of a sudden you eliminate your possibility of winning the division and you're left into the wild card conversation, which obviously is a whole different discussion as well. All right, that is going to wrap up Thursday's edition of Big Blue Kickoff Live. A reminder that you can take your fandom to the next level with a Giants season ticket membership. Catch all the action at MetLife Stadium with an exciting home schedule on the horizon. Speaking of the schedule that we're just discussing, with a membership, you'll also stay connected to the club all year round, not just on game days, with exclusive member access and benefits. To learn more about a New York Giants season ticket membership, you can head to giants.com/tickets. As this was the latest edition of Big Blue Kickoff Live, part of the Giants platforms everywhere, and giants.com/podcast, brought to you by Cadillac, the official luxury vehicle of the New York Football Giants. For Paul Dottino, I'm Lance Medow. Stay locked to giants.com for all the latest, as we'll speak to you on Friday here on Big Blue Kickoff Live. Have a good one.